deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where winter can kill and stores are 100 miles away, 16-year-old Marcus Webb had solved the impossible. While his neighbors watched their meat spoil within weeks, Marcus's venison stayed fresh for 8 months. No electricity, no refrigeration, just an ancient stone cellar his grandfather built and a technique that shouldn't exist. When food inspectors arrived after reports of his miracle preservation, Marcus reluctantly led them down the narrow stone steps. The cellar was ordinary, rough walls, dirt floor, wooden shelves, but the temperature readings made no sense. 42 degrees, constant, even in summer's blazing heat. How? The lead inspector demanded. Marcus ran his fingers along a seemingly random stone pattern carved into the wall. "My grandfather wasn't just a mountain man," he whispered. "He was a brilliant engineer who fled here during the war. This cellar uses principles that died with him." But as Marcus revealed the intricate airflow system hidden within the mountain itself, the inspectors realized they weren't just looking at food preservation. They were staring at technology that could change everything. What other secrets had his grandfather buried in these mountains? The lead inspector, a weathered woman named Janet Reeves, knelt beside the carved stones, her flashlight illuminating symbols that looked almost mathematical in their precision. "These markings, they're not random, are they?" Marcus shook his head, his lanky frame casting long shadows against the cellar walls. Grandfather called them breath maps. Each line shows how air moves through the mountain. He spent 3 years charting every wind current, every temperature pocket before he carved the first stone. Dr. Samuel Chen, the second inspector, held his digital thermometer steady. The reading hadn't wavered in 20 minutes. "This is impossible. The ambient temperature outside is 87 degrees. There's no way a passive system could maintain this differential." "Tell that to my meat," Marcus said quietly, gesturing toward the wooden shelves lined with cuts of venison that looked as fresh as the day they were butchered. The inspectors had already taken samples, and preliminary tests confirmed what seemed impossible. The meat showed no signs of bacterial growth, no degradation that should have occurred months ago. Janet traced her finger along one of the carved channels. "Your grandfather, what was his name?" "Heinrich Webb. Well, that's what he called himself up here. Before that—" Marcus hesitated, glancing toward the cellar's entrance as if someone might be listening. "Before that, he was Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann. He worked for the German government during the war, but not on weapons, on preservation, food storage for submarines that stayed underwater for months." The implications hit both inspectors simultaneously. Dr. Chen lowered his thermometer, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching awe. He was working on extended submarine missions. Of course, the German U-boat program had persistent supply issues. "But why here?" Janet asked. "Why hide in the mountains?" Marcus walked to the far corner of the cellar, where shadows seemed to gather despite their flashlights. He said he was running from people who wanted to use his work for the wrong reasons, said they wanted to turn food preservation into something else entirely. His voice dropped. Something about controlling populations through scarcity. A chill that had nothing to do with the cellar's temperature ran down Janet's spine. She'd seen enough government classifications to know that wartime research often had dual purposes. "Marcus, has anyone else been asking about this cellar? Any visitors, researchers, government people?" "Not until last week." Marcus turned back to them, and in the artificial light he looked far older than 16. There was a man in an expensive suit. Said he represented some university, but his questions weren't about food preservation. He wanted to know about the airflow patterns, about whether grandfather had built other cellars. Dr. Chen and Janet exchanged glances. This was no longer about food safety violations or impossible temperature readings. This was about technology that could revolutionize cold storage, reduce global food waste, and potentially save millions of lives in regions without reliable electricity. Or, in the wrong hands, it could become something far more sinister. "Marcus," Janet said carefully, "we need to document everything, every carving, every measurement, every detail your grandfather shared with you. But first, I need you to tell me, Did this man in the suit say when he might come back? The teenager's face went pale. He said he'd return with a team, said they'd make it worth my while to share grandfather's secrets. Marcus paused, his hand instinctively moving to his pocket. But grandfather warned me about people like that. Before he died, he made me promise something. What kind of promise? Dr. Chen asked. Marcus pulled a worn brass key from his pocket, its surface etched with the same mathematical symbols that covered the cellar walls. He said if anyone ever came asking too many questions, I should use this. Said there were things down here that needed to stay buried. Janet stared at the key, her mind racing. Things? What kind of things, Marcus? The boy looked toward a section of the cellar wall that appeared solid stone, but now, studying it more carefully, Janet could see faint outline marks. Another door, another room. I don't know, Marcus whispered. Grandfather made me swear I'd never open it unless I had no choice. Outside, gravel crunched under approaching tires. The smell hit Dr. Sarah Chen first, not the expected stench of decay, but something else entirely, clean, almost sterile. She exchanged glances with Detective Marcus Webb as they approached the modest cabin nestled against the pine-covered slope of Mount Cascade. You sure this is the right place? Webb asked, consulting his notes. Thomas Hartwell, age 24, no formal education past 8th grade. Sarah nodded, adjusting her field kit. As a forensic anthropologist, she'd seen her share of unusual preservation methods, but the preliminary reports from the health inspector had been baffling enough to warrant a joint investigation. Meat stored for months without refrigeration, yet fresher than anything found in most grocery stores. It defied every principle of decomposition she knew. The cabin's front door opened before they could knock. A young man emerged, tall and lean with prematurely weathered hands and eyes that seemed older than his years. His dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and he wore clothes that spoke of practical mountain living: flannel shirt, worn jeans, sturdy boots. You the investigators? Thomas Hartwell's voice carried a slight tremor, though whether from nervousness or something else, Sarah couldn't tell. Dr. Chen, and this is Detective Webb, Sarah said, extending her hand. Thomas hesitated before shaking it, his palms surprisingly cold despite the warm afternoon. We'd like to discuss your preservation methods, if you don't mind. Don't mind at all. His response came too quickly, too rehearsed, though I'm not sure what all the fuss is about, just using techniques my grandfather taught me. Webb stepped forward. According to the health department, you've been supplying Millfield's general store with preserved meat for the past 6 months. Venison, elk, even some wild boar, all of it tested completely free of harmful bacteria. That's right. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Nothing wrong with providing quality meat to folks in town. Sarah studied his face. In her experience, people hiding something often over-explained or under-explained. Thomas was definitely in the latter category. Would you mind showing us your setup? Professional curiosity. Thomas glanced toward the tree line behind his cabin, then back at them. Sure, though it's nothing fancy, just an old root cellar my family's been using for generations. He led them around the cabin's side, past a modest vegetable garden and a stack of split firewood. The entrance to the root cellar was typical, wooden doors set at an angle against the hillside. But as Thomas lifted the heavy planks, Sarah caught that same clean smell again, stronger now. After you, Thomas said, though his tone suggested he'd rather they declined. Sarah descended the wooden steps first, Webb close behind. The temperature dropped noticeably, and she estimated they were at least 8 feet underground. Battery-powered lanterns illuminated stone walls that looked hand-carved, extending much deeper into the hillside than any root cellar had reason to go. Impressive stonework, Webb commented, running his hand along the wall. Your grandfather built this? Family project. Took years. Thomas's voice echoed strangely in the confined space. The meat stored back here. He guided them deeper, past shelves lined with preserved vegetables and mason jars. The main storage area opened into a natural cave chamber, and Sarah's breath caught. Hanging from wooden beams were dozens of cuts of meat, each wrapped in what appeared to be some kind of translucent membrane. The air was cool and dry, with that persistent sterile quality. "What's the wrapping material?" Sarah asked, approaching one of the hanging pieces. Up close, the membrane looked almost organic, with a subtle, iridescent quality. "Family secret," Thomas said quickly. "Natural preservative. My grandfather developed it." Sarah noticed Webb examining the cave walls more carefully. Ancient-looking symbols were carved into the stone, weathered but still visible. They didn't match any Native American petroglyphs she recognized. "These markings," Webb said. "They part of the family tradition too?" Thomas moved between Webb and the wall. "Just decorative stuff. You know how it is with old-timers, always carving up caves." But Sarah was focused on something else now. The meat closest to her wasn't just well preserved, it looked almost alive. The surface had a subtle rhythmic movement like breathing. When she reached out to touch it, Thomas's hand shot out to stop her. "I wouldn't," he said, and for the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. "Some of the older cuts can be unstable. Chemicals my grandfather used weren't always FDA approved, if you know what I mean." Webb had moved to examine another section of the chamber. "Thomas, this cave system extends pretty far back, doesn't it? These passages look like they go on for quite a distance." "Some do. Most are blocked off now. Cave-ins, you know. Mountains not as stable as it used to be." Sarah noticed Thomas was perspiring despite the cool temperature. She also noticed something else, a sound, barely audible, coming from deeper in the cave system, a rhythmic thumping, almost like a heartbeat. "What's that noise?" she asked. Thomas's face went pale, probably just water dripping. These old caves, they echo everything. But Sarah knew the difference between dripping water and what she was hearing, and judging by Webb's expression, so did he. The coroner's office in Pine Ridge had seen its share of unusual cases, but nothing quite like this. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her glasses as she stared at the tissue samples under the microscope, her brow furrowed in concentration. The meat samples Marcus had provided defied every principle of decomposition she knew. "This is impossible," she muttered, switching to a higher magnification. The cellular structure remained perfectly intact, as if the animal had been slaughtered hours ago rather than months. No bacterial growth, no enzymatic breakdown, no signs of traditional preservation methods like salt curing or smoking. Detective Ray Morrison stood beside her, coffee growing cold in his hands. "What exactly are we looking at, Doc?" "Meat that shouldn't exist." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "I've tested for every known preservative, sodium nitrite, potassium sorbate, even exotic compounds. Nothing. Yet these cells are in pristine condition. It's like time stopped the moment the animal died." Ray's phone buzzed. A text from his partner. "Background check on Marcus Thorne complete. No criminal record, but get this, he's lived alone up there for 12 years, since he was 16. 16, Ray said aloud, showing Sarah the message. "Kid's been living in isolation since he was a teenager. What happened to his family?" Before Sarah could respond, her assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Chen? You asked me to run additional tests on the soil samples from the Thorne property. Come in, Jamie. What did you find?" Jamie, a young lab technician with nervous energy, consulted his tablet. "The soil composition is unusual. There are trace minerals I can't identify, and the pH levels are off the charts, extremely alkaline, but not in any pattern that occurs naturally." Ray set down his coffee. "What kind of minerals?" "That's just it. They don't match anything in our database. I've sent samples to the state lab, but preliminary analysis suggests they might be synthetic, or at least artificially concentrated." Sarah and Ray exchanged glances. The pieces weren't forming a clear picture yet, but something was definitely wrong on Marcus's mountain. An hour later, Ray found himself driving back up the winding mountain road, this time with a search warrant tucked in his jacket pocket. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pine trees, and the temperature had dropped considerably since morning. His radio crackled with static as he climbed higher, the signal from town growing weaker. Marcus's cabin looked different in the fading light, more isolated, more ominous. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but there was no sign of the young man. Ray parked and approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. "Marcus? Police. I'd like to speak with you." No response. Ray knocked on the heavy wooden door, noting the unusual craftsmanship. The logs were fitted with precision that suggested professional skill, yet Marcus had been living here since he was 16. Who taught him to build like this? The door creaked open at his touch, unlocked. Ray's training kicked in as he stepped inside, calling out again. The interior was neat, sparse, but comfortable. Hand-carved furniture, oil lamps, no sign of electricity. Books lined makeshift shelves, an eclectic mix of subjects: chemistry, geology, anatomy, and survival guides. But it was the journal lying open on the kitchen table that made Ray's blood run cold. The handwriting was precise, almost obsessive, detailing experiments with preservation protocols and substrate enhancement, pages and pages of notes about maintaining optimal specimen integrity, and references to something called the deep cache. Ray photographed several pages with his phone before continuing his search. Behind the cabin, he found what looked like a root cellar entrance, heavy wooden doors set into the hillside at an angle. But when he pulled them open, expecting to find a simple underground storage room, he discovered stone steps descending much deeper than any root cellar had reason to go. The smell that wafted up wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was wrong. Too clean, too sterile, with an underlying chemical tang that reminded him of hospitals. Ray called for backup, though he doubted they'd reach him before nightfall. The radio crackled with broken transmissions, something about the elevation and mineral deposits interfering with signals. He was on his own. Against his better judgment, he started down the steps, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The walls were carved from solid rock, but lined with some kind of white, tile-like material. After 20 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Ray's flashlight beam swept across the space, and he had to steady himself against the wall. Hanging from the ceiling were dozens of wrapped bundles, each about the size and shape of a human body. The preservation technique Marcus had demonstrated wasn't just for feeding himself through winter. A sound echoed from deeper in the tunnel system, footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. Someone was coming, and Ray had a sinking feeling he knew who it was. The young man who had seemed so nervous and innocent that morning was walking toward him through the darkness. But the Marcus approaching now moved with the confidence of someone completely at home in this underground chamber of horrors. The descent into Marcus Thorne's underground chamber felt like entering another world entirely. Detective Sarah Chen followed the beam of her flashlight down the crude stone steps, each footfall echoing in the narrow passage. The air grew noticeably cooler with every step, carrying with it an earthy scent mixed with something else, something that made her skin prickle with unease. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves moved behind her, documenting everything with her camera's flash, illuminating the rough-hewn walls in stark bursts of light. "The temperature drop is significant," she murmured, her breath beginning to mist. "We're talking about a natural refrigeration system here." The passage opened into a vast cavern that defied the modest proportions of the cabin above. Sarah's flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing an intricate network of wooden shelving and hanging systems. Sides of beef, whole chickens, and various cuts of meat hung from metal hooks, all appearing remarkably fresh, despite the absence of any modern refrigeration equipment. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying in the still air. "How big is this place?" Marcus appeared beside them, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the space. "Goes back about 200 feet, maybe more. My grandfather started digging it out in the 1940s. My father expanded it. I've just been maintaining what they built." Dr. Reeves approached one of the hanging beef quarters, pulling out a small digital thermometer. The meat appears to be in perfect condition. No signs of decomposition, No bacterial growth that I can detect without proper testing. She paused, checking her readings. Temperature is holding steady at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah examined the shelving system more closely. The wood appeared old but well maintained, with careful attention paid to air circulation. You said your grandfather started this. What made him think it would work? Marcus hesitated, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping at his sides. He was different, had ideas about things that most folks didn't understand. Said the mountain had its own way of preserving what was important. That's not an answer, Sarah pressed. There has to be a scientific explanation for this. Dr. Reeves had moved deeper into the cavern, her voice echoing back to them. Sarah, you need to see this. They followed the sound of her voice through a narrow passage that opened into a second chamber. Here the setup was different. Instead of hanging meat, there were stone tables arranged in precise rows. On each table sat various containers, glass jars, wooden boxes, metal tins, all labeled with dates stretching back decades. Some of these labels are from the 1960s, Dr. Reeves said, her scientific composure beginning to crack. If what's in these containers is still preserved. Marcus stepped forward, his reluctance evident. My grandfather called it his insurance policy, said we needed to be ready for when the world above stopped working. Sarah picked up one of the glass jars, holding it up to her flashlight. Inside, what appeared to be vegetables floated in a clear liquid. The date on the label read September 1967. This is impossible. Nothing preserves for that long without degradation. Open it, Marcus said quietly. Dr. Reeves looked at Sarah, who nodded. With careful movements, the scientist twisted off the metal lid. Instead of the putrid smell they both expected, a surprisingly fresh aroma filled the air. Dr. Reeves examined the contents more closely, her expression growing increasingly troubled. The cellular structure appears intact, she said, more to herself than to the others. This defies everything we know about organic decomposition. Sarah set the jar down, her mind racing through possibilities. Marcus, what exactly did your grandfather do? What was his background? The old man's face grew shadowed in the flashlight beams. He worked for the government during the war. Never talked much about it, but he came back here with knowledge about things that weren't in any textbook. Said he'd learned how to make life last longer than it was supposed to. What kind of government work? Sarah's detective instincts were now in full alert mode. Don't rightly know. He had papers, documents he kept locked away. My father burned most of it after grandfather died, said it wasn't safe to keep around. Dr. Reeves had moved to another table, examining more containers. Sarah, some of these preservation methods, they're not just advanced, they're completely unknown to modern science. If we could understand how this works, the applications would be revolutionary. But Sarah was thinking about something else entirely. Marcus, in all the years your family has been doing this, has anyone else ever found out about it? Has anyone ever come asking questions? The old man's silence stretched uncomfortably long. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was a man who came around about 10 years ago, government type, like you but different. Asked a lot of questions about my grandfather's work. What happened to him? Marcus looked directly at Sarah, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something in his eyes that made her hand unconsciously move toward her weapon. He never left the mountain. The descent into Marcus Thorne's hidden chambers felt like entering another world. Detective Sarah Chen's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing carved stone walls that bore no resemblance to any modern excavation. The air grew colder with each step, carrying an antiseptic quality that seemed almost medicinal. Jesus, Officer Rodriguez whispered behind her, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. How deep does this go? Dr. Evelyn Cross, the forensic specialist they'd called in after yesterday, disturbing discoveries, paused to examine the walls more closely. Her fingers traced what appeared to be symbols etched into the stone, not random scratches, but deliberate markings that seemed to follow some kind of pattern. These aren't recent, she murmured. The tool marks suggest hand carving, probably over years, maybe decades. Sarah felt her chest tighten as they continued downward. The stairs were worn smooth, evidence of countless trips up and down these hidden passages. Whatever Marcus had been doing down here, it wasn't a recent development. The stairwell opened into a large chamber that defied explanation. Sarah's breath caught as her flashlight revealed the scope of the underground facility. The room stretched at least 30 feet in each direction, with a ceiling high enough that her beam barely reached the top. Along the walls, metal shelving units held rows of glass containers, each one filled with what appeared to be perfectly preserved meat samples. But it was the center of the room that made Sarah's blood run cold. A stainless steel table dominated the space, its surface gleaming under their flashlights. Surgical instruments lay arranged with military precision on a nearby tray. 4 stands flanked the table, their tubes snaking down to collection vessels that Sarah didn't want to examine too closely. "This isn't food preservation," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is a laboratory." Dr. Cross moved to the shelving units, her scientific curiosity overriding the horror of their discovery. She peered into the glass containers, her expression growing more troubled with each specimen she examined. "Sarah, you need to see this." Cross's voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. "These samples, they're not all animal tissue." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She forced herself to approach the shelving unit, though every instinct screamed at her to retreat. The containers were meticulously labeled with dates and cryptic notations in Marcus's precise handwriting. The earliest dates went back nearly 15 years. "Subject 7, Day 14, Sarah read from one label. "Cellular degradation minimal. Consider increasing preservation compound concentration." Rodriguez had found a filing cabinet in one corner of the chamber. His hands shook as he opened the top drawer, revealing manila folders stuffed with photographs and documents. He pulled out a photograph and immediately turned away, his face pale. "We need backup," he said, his voice strained. "We need the whole damn task force down here." Sarah took the photograph from his trembling hands and felt her stomach lurch. It showed the steel table, but it wasn't empty. A human form lay strapped to its surface, connected to the 4 apparatus. The person's face was visible, eyes closed, but whether they were unconscious or worse was impossible to determine. Dr. Cross had moved to a computer terminal tucked into an alcove. The screen flickered to life when she touched the keyboard, displaying what appeared to be a complex database. Entry after entry scrolled past, each one documenting what looked like experimental procedures. "He's been keeping records," she said, her professional demeanor barely containing her revulsion. "Detailed records, temperature variations, chemical compositions, success rates." She paused, her face growing ashen. "Success rates for preservation of living tissue." The implications crashed over Sarah like a tide. The missing hikers, the 2 perfect meat that had started this investigation. The isolation of Marcus's cabin, far from prying eyes and curious neighbors. A sound from above made all 3 investigators freeze, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor of the cabin overhead. Sarah drew her weapon, motioning for the others to stay back. The footsteps moved across the living room, paused, then continued toward the kitchen, toward the hidden entrance to their current location. "He's back," Rodriguez whispered, his own gun now drawn. The footsteps stopped directly above them. In the silence that followed, Sarah could hear her heart hammering against her ribs. Then, the unmistakable sound of the refrigerator being moved aside. Light filtered down from above as the hidden entrance opened. Sarah positioned herself at the bottom of the stairs, weapon trained upward, while Cross huddled behind the filing cabinet, and Rodriguez took cover behind the steel table. "I know you're down there." Marcus's voice drifted down, calm and conversational. "I saw your cars. Rather careless of you to park where I could spot them from the ridge trail." Sarah's finger tightened on her trigger as a shadow appeared at the top of the stairs. "You really shouldn't have come here alone," Marcus continued, his tone almost sympathetic. Now we're all going to have to become part of the preservation process. The silence in Dr. Hendrick's laboratory stretched like a taut wire as she stared at the test results for the third time. Behind her, Agent Morrison shifted restlessly, the leather of his jacket creaking in the sterile quiet. "This can't be right," she murmured, her fingers trembling as she held the printout. "I've run the analysis 4 times. The cellular structure. It's impossible." Morrison moved closer, studying her face rather than the papers. In his years of investigation, he'd learned to read people better than evidence. Right now, Dr. Hendricks looked like someone who'd just discovered the laws of physics were merely suggestions. "What exactly are you seeing?" She set down the papers and walked to the microscope, gesturing for him to look. "The meat samples you brought me, they're not just preserved. The cellular degradation has completely stopped, not slowed, stopped, as if time itself has been suspended at the molecular level." Morrison peered through the eyepiece, seeing only an incomprehensible dance of shapes and shadows. "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning this meat could theoretically remain fresh indefinitely. No bacteria, no decomposition, no cellular breakdown whatsoever. It's like Ethan has discovered a way to freeze biological time without actually freezing the tissue." The weight of her words settled between them. Morrison had seen strange things in his career, cases that defied explanation until they didn't. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. His phone buzzed. A text from Deputy Chen. "Found something at the mountain site. You need to see this. Come alone." Morrison frowned at the last part. Chen wasn't one for dramatics, which made the message more unsettling than reassuring. "I need to head back up the mountain," he told Dr. Hendricks. "Can you keep running tests? Try to figure out how this is possible." She nodded absently, already turning back to her equipment with the single-minded focus of a scientist who'd glimpsed something that challenged everything she knew. The drive up to Ethan's property took Morrison through increasingly dense forest, the canopy above growing thick enough to block most of the afternoon sun. He'd made this trip twice before, but today something felt different about the mountain itself, more watchful, more alive. He found Deputy Chen standing near the entrance to Ethan's underground chamber, her face pale and drawn. She'd been a steady presence throughout this investigation, unflappable in the face of mountain folks' eccentricities and the growing strangeness surrounding the case. Seeing her rattled sent a chill through Morrison's chest. "What did you find?" Without speaking, Chen led him down into the chamber. The space felt different in the afternoon light filtering through the entrance, less like a simple root cellar and more like something ancient and purposeful. The carved walls seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and Morrison found himself unconsciously matching his breathing to whatever cadence the mountain was keeping. Chen stopped near the far wall, where Morrison now noticed a section of stone that looked different from the rest, newer somehow, though still clearly old. "I was doing one more sweep, checking for anything we might have missed," Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I noticed this wall sounded hollow when I tapped it, so she gestured helplessly, "I found the mechanism." Morrison saw it then, a small stone that protruded just slightly from the wall, worn smooth by countless touches. Chen pressed it, and a section of the wall swung inward with surprising silence. Beyond lay another chamber, smaller than the first but carved with even more intricate detail. The walls here weren't just decorated. They were covered in symbols that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. But it wasn't the carvings that made Morrison's breath catch in his throat. It was the meat. Hanging throughout the chamber were dozens of cuts, arranged with careful precision. But these weren't the simple preservation efforts they'd found before. These pieces had been shaped, carved into forms that were almost sculptural, and they all looked fresh, as if they'd been hung moments ago. "There's more," Chen said, pointing to the far end of the chamber. Morrison followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Along the back wall, carefully arranged on stone shelves, were personal items, watches, jewelry, scraps of clothing, things that looked like they belonged to people. Missing persons reports, Chen said quietly. I checked on the way up. Over the past 5 years, 7 hikers have disappeared in this mountain range, assumed to be lost to the wilderness or wild animals. Morrison stared at the collection, his mind racing. The preserved meat, the impossible science, the missing hikers, pieces of a puzzle that formed a picture he didn't want to see clearly. Where's Ethan now? That's the problem, Chen replied. No one's seen him since yesterday. Mrs. Patterson down at the general store said he usually comes in every few days, regular as clockwork. But he never showed. Morrison felt the mountain silence pressing down on them, heavy with secrets and the weight of something ancient, stirring in the deep places beneath their feet. The morning air carried an unusual stillness as Dr. Sarah Chen made her way down the rocky path toward Elias Thorne's cabin. Behind her, Agent Marcus Rivera's footsteps crunched against loose gravel, each step echoing her own mounting unease. The preliminary lab results had arrived at dawn, and what they revealed defied every principle of food science she'd spent 15 years studying. The meat samples they'd collected showed cellular preservation at a level that shouldn't exist without industrial-grade equipment. More disturbing was the presence of an unknown protein compound that seemed to actively repair tissue damage. The implication sent ice through her veins. If Elias had discovered something this revolutionary, why was he living in isolation on a forgotten mountainside? He's not answering, Rivera called out, stepping back from the cabin door after a series of unanswered knocks. The agent's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon as he peered through the dust-filmed windows. Place looks empty. Sarah approached the nearest window, cupping her hands against the glass. The interior lay in shadow, but she could make out overturned furniture and scattered papers. Something's wrong. Yesterday this place was pristine. Rivera tried the door handle, finding it unlocked. The hinges groaned as they stepped inside, immediately hit by the acrid smell of burned paper. The stone fireplace contained fresh ashes, still warm to the touch. Sarah knelt beside the remnants, recognizing the charred edges of photographs and what appeared to be research notes. He knew we were coming back, she murmured, sifting through the ashes with a poker. He's destroyed evidence. A thorough search of the cabin revealed little. Elias had been methodical in his erasure, but Rivera's trained eye caught something Sarah missed, a loose floorboard near the kitchen area. Beneath it, they found a single leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The entries were written in a cramped, urgent handwriting that spoke of months, perhaps years of experimentation. The early pages documented Elias's initial discovery of the underground chamber, describing it as a natural formation with unusual mineral properties. Listen to this, Sarah said, reading aloud. Day 43, the preservation effect isn't just maintaining tissue integrity, it's enhancing it. Muscle fibers are restructuring, becoming denser, stronger. The compound I've isolated appears to be triggering controlled regeneration at the cellular level. Rivera leaned over her shoulder, frowning at the technical terminology. What does that mean in plain English? It means he wasn't just preserving meat, Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He was improving it, making it better somehow. The later entries grew increasingly erratic. Elias wrote about consuming small amounts of the treated meat himself, documenting changes in his physical capabilities, increased strength, enhanced endurance, accelerated healing from minor cuts and bruises. But there were concerning notes too, mentions of disturbing dreams, periods of lost time, and a growing compulsion to return to the underground chamber. Day 112, Sarah continued. I understand now why this place was hidden. The indigenous peoples knew. They sealed it for a reason. But the potential, the applications for medicine, for human enhancement, I can't simply bury this discovery, yet I fear I'm losing myself to it. The final entries were nearly illegible, filled with paranoid ramblings about watchers in the woods and voices calling from deep underground. The last legible entry was dated just 3 days prior. They're coming. I can feel them getting closer. The compound, it doesn't just preserve and enhance. It connects. It calls to its own kind. I was a fool to think I could control it. Sarah closed the journal, her scientific curiosity warring with a growing sense of dread. We need to find that underground chamber. First, we need to find Elias, Rivera countered. A man doesn't just vanish without a trace. Their debate was interrupted by a sound from outside, footsteps on the gravel path, but with an odd shuffling quality. Rivera drew his weapon as they moved to the window. Through the glass, they watched a figure approaching the cabin, moving with jerky, unnatural movements. It was Elias, but something was terribly wrong. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes held an unfocused, glassy quality. Most disturbing were his hands. The fingers had elongated, ending in what appeared to be hardened, claw-like nails. "Jesus Christ," Rivera whispered. "What happened to him?" Elias stopped just outside the cabin, his head tilting at an unnatural angle as if listening to something only he could hear. When he spoke, his voice carried a hollow, echoing quality that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than his throat. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, though his lips barely moved. "It's too late now. The awakening has begun, and it hungers for more than just preservation." Sarah gripped Rivera's arm, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. Whatever Elias had discovered in that underground chamber, it had fundamentally changed him, and she suspected their investigation had only scratched the surface of something far more ancient and dangerous than a simple food preservation technique. The descent into Tobias's underground chamber felt like entering another world entirely. Dr. Sarah Chen's headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing walls that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. Behind her, Detective Marcus Rivera's breathing echoed in the confined space, while Agent Lisa Park documented every detail with her camera. "Jesus Christ," Rivera muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" The chamber stretched further than their lights could reach, its ceiling disappearing into blackness above. What had appeared from the surface to be a simple root cellar revealed itself as an extensive network of tunnels and rooms carved directly into the living rock. But it wasn't the architecture that made Chen's blood run cold. It was what lined the walls. Hundreds of glass containers, each filled with a translucent amber-colored substance, were embedded into niches carved with surgical precision. Inside each container, preserved specimens floated in perfect suspension. Not just meat, as they had expected, but organs, tissue samples, and things that defied immediate classification. "Dr. Chen," Park called out, her voice tight with controlled fear. "You need to see this." Chen moved toward Park's position, her footsteps echoing strangely in the space. The acoustics were wrong somehow, as if the chamber absorbed and redirected sound in unnatural ways. Park stood before a section of wall where the containers were larger, more elaborate. "Look at the dates," Park whispered, pointing to small metal plaques beneath each vessel. Chen's headlamp illuminated the engravings. The earliest date she could see was 1987, nearly 40 years ago. But as they moved deeper into the chamber, the dates grew older still. 1952, 1934, 1918. "That's impossible," Rivera said, joining them. "Tobias can't be more than 35 years old." "Then someone else started this," Chen replied, though her scientific mind struggled to process what she was seeing. "The preservation technique. It's not just keeping the organic matter fresh, it's maintaining it in a state that appears to halt cellular degradation entirely." They moved through the chamber in single file, following a path that seemed to lead toward a central area. Chen noticed that the temperature remained constant despite their depth, and there was no musty odor she would have expected from an underground space. Instead, the air carried a faint, sweet scent that reminded her of ozone after a thunderstorm. "Motion sensors," Park announced, pointing to small devices mounted at regular intervals along the walls. "This place is monitored." Rivera's hand moved instinctively to his weapon. "Which means Tobias knows we're here." As if summoned by his words, a soft mechanical hum filled the chamber. Emergency lighting flickered to life, revealing the true scope of the underground complex. What they had taken for a single room was actually the main hub of a vast network. Tunnels branched off in 6 different directions, each lined with more preservation chambers. But it was the central area that drew their immediate attention. A circular platform rose from the floor, topped with equipment that looked decades ahead of anything Chen had seen in her research facilities. Monitors displayed scrolling data, vital signs, and complex molecular diagrams that shifted and evolved in real time. "Welcome to my life's work," came a voice from the shadows beyond the platform. Tobias emerged into the light, but he looked different from the simple mountain dweller they had encountered above ground. Gone was the rough clothing and hesitant demeanor. He wore a clean white lab coat over dark clothing, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce right through them. "Dr. Chen, I presume," he continued, stepping onto the platform with fluid grace. "Your reputation in cellular biology precedes you, though I suspect you're about to encounter concepts that will challenge everything you thought you knew about life and death." Rivera stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "Tobias Fletcher, you're under arrest for what, exactly?" Tobias interrupted with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "For advancing human knowledge? For solving problems that have plagued our species for millennia? For preparing for what's coming?" "What's coming?" Park demanded, her camera still recording. Tobias gestured to the monitors around him. "The data has been clear for years. Climate change, resource depletion, societal collapse. They're not possibilities anymore, they're inevitabilities. The question isn't whether civilization will fall, but whether any of us will survive when it does." Chen found herself drawn toward one of the displays, despite every instinct telling her to run. The molecular diagrams were unlike anything she had ever seen, showing protein structures that seemed to exist in impossible configurations. "You're not just preserving organic matter," she said, realization dawning. "You're modifying it, enhancing it, evolving it," Tobias corrected. "The preservation technique is just the beginning. What you see here represents decades of work toward a single goal, creating a form of human life that can survive anything. Extreme temperatures, radiation exposure, starvation, disease. The next phase of human evolution, prepared for whatever catastrophe awaits." Rivera's radio crackled with static, then went silent. In the sudden quiet, they could hear something else, footsteps echoing from the tunnels around them, growing closer. "You brought friends," Tobias observed pleasantly. "How thoughtful. We'll need test subjects." The descent into Ezra's tunnel system felt like entering the throat of some ancient beast. Detective Sarah Chen's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying scents she couldn't identify, metallic, earthy, and something else that made her stomach turn. Dr. Reeves squeezed past them, his scientific curiosity overriding caution. "The temperature differential is remarkable. It's at least 15 degrees cooler down here than at surface level." He ran his hand along the smooth wall. "These aren't natural rock formations. Look at these grooves. They're too precise, too intentional." Sarah aimed her light ahead, where the tunnel branched into 3 separate passages. Each opening yawned like a mouth, darker than the others. The preservation chambers they'd discovered earlier were just the beginning. This was something far more elaborate, a subterranean network that suggested years, maybe decades of construction. "We should wait for backup," Marcus said, but his words lacked conviction. They all felt the pull of discovery, the need to understand what Ezra had built beneath his property. "The middle passage shows signs of recent use," Sarah observed, noting the worn floor and the absence of cobwebs that decorated the other entrances. "We follow that one." "Are those—" Marcus couldn't finish the question. "Human tissue samples," Dr. Reeves confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the preservation method, I've never seen anything like it. No formaldehyde, no visible preservatives, yet they appear to be in perfect condition." Sarah moved her light across the room, documenting everything. Journals lay open on the tables, filled with meticulous notes written in Ezra's careful handwriting. Diagrams showed anatomical drawings with measurements and observations that made her skin crawl. This wasn't just preservation, this was experimentation. "Look at this," Dr. Reeves called from across the chamber. He stood before a massive glass tank, easily 8 feet tall and filled with a clear fluid. Inside, suspended like a grotesque angel, floated something that had once been human. The body was perfectly preserved, every detail intact but wrong somehow. The limbs were too long, the joints bent at impossible angles. Most disturbing of all, the eyes were open, staring directly at them through the glass with an awareness that should have been impossible. "It moved," Marcus said suddenly, backing away from the tank. "I swear to God, it moved." "That's impossible," Dr. Reeves began, but his words died as they all watched the figure's head turn slowly, tracking their movement around the tank. The eyes followed them with unmistakable intelligence. Sarah felt her training kick in, pushing down the primal terror that threatened to overwhelm her logic. "We need to document everything and get out, now." But as she turned toward the entrance, her flashlight revealed that they were no longer alone. Ezra stood in the mouth of the tunnel, blocking their exit. In the harsh beam of her light, he looked different, younger somehow, his weathered features smooth in ways that shouldn't have been possible for a man his age. "You shouldn't have come down here," he said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." "Ezra, we can work this out," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Whatever's been happening here, we can help you." He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Help me. Detective, I passed beyond needing help decades ago. What you see here is the culmination of a lifetime's work, the preservation of life itself, true preservation, not the crude methods your science understands." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, his scientific mind still engaged, despite the horror surrounding them. "The technique, how did you discover it? The cellular integrity is remarkable." "Discovery?" Ezra's smile was cold. "I didn't discover anything. I was taught, just as my father was taught, and his father before him. This knowledge has been in my family for generations, passed down from those who came before." Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Other tanks were emerging from the shadows, each containing figures that watched their interaction with disturbing attention. The chamber was larger than she'd initially realized, extending far beyond the reach of their flashlights. "The missing hikers," she said, understanding flooding through her with sick clarity. "You didn't just preserve animals." "They were dying anyway," Ezra replied matter-of-factly. "Lost, injured, hypothermic. I offered them eternal preservation instead of meaningless death. Some call it murder. I call it salvation." The photographs spread across Marcus's desk told a story that defied everything they thought they knew. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her glasses, studying the thermal imaging shots taken from the helicopter flyover 3 days ago. The underground chamber wasn't just a preservation facility, it was part of something much larger. "These heat signatures extend for nearly half a mile," Sarah said, tracing the infrared patterns with her finger. "Whatever's down there, it's active, living." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the springs protesting under his weight. The investigation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated when they first received reports of Ezra Thorne's impossibly fresh meat. What started as curiosity about unconventional preservation methods had evolved into something that made his skin crawl. "The boy's been lying to us from the beginning," Detective Riley said, entering the room with a steaming cup of coffee. "His story about family techniques and old mountain ways, it's all fabrication." Sarah pulled up another image on her laptop. The soil analysis came back from the lab. The samples we took near his property showed traces of nitrogen compounds consistent with decomposition, but in concentrations that suggest massive biological activity. Whatever's down there, it's processing organic matter on an industrial scale. The implications hung heavy in the room. Marcus had seen enough in his 20 years with the department to recognize when a case was about to take a dark turn. The missing hikers from the past 2 years, the unexplained disappearances that the Forest Service had attributed to bear attacks or getting lost in the wilderness. Suddenly, they seemed connected to the quiet young man who claimed he was just preserving meat, the way his grandfather taught him. Sarah shook her head. The Geological Survey team won't be here until tomorrow. We don't know the stability of those tunnels, and if something goes wrong, more people could disappear, Marcus interrupted. He'd made his decision. Riley's right. We can't wait. The equipment checklist felt inadequate for what they might encounter. Flashlights, rope, emergency beacons, and standard-issue sidearms seemed insufficient protection against the unknown. Sarah insisted on bringing her portable testing kit, convinced that whatever they found would require immediate analysis. As twilight settled over the mountains, they parked a quarter-mile from Ezra's cabin. The windows were dark, just as they'd been for the past 2 days since the boy had seemingly vanished. Marcus wondered if their investigation had spooked him into running or if something else had claimed him. The entrance to the underground chamber was exactly where the thermal imaging indicated, a natural depression behind a cluster of boulders that looked like random geological formation. Up close, the signs of human modification were obvious. Stone had been carefully arranged, earth moved with purpose. The smell, Riley whispered as they descended. The odor wasn't the rot they'd expected, but something else entirely, sweet, cloying, with an underlying metallic tang that made their throats constrict. The tunnel walls were lined with a substance that glistened in their flashlight beams. Sarah scraped a sample into a sterile container, her movements quick and nervous. The material felt organic, almost alive under her touch. 20 feet underground, the passage opened into the chamber they'd seen in Ezra's photographs, but their lights revealed details the boy's crude pictures had missed. The meat hanging from the ceiling wasn't just preserved, it was changing, transforming into something that still resembled animal flesh but possessed characteristics that belonged to no terrestrial creature. Jesus Christ, Riley breathed. The preservation wasn't stopping decomposition, it was redirecting it. The meat was becoming something else, developing new textures, new properties. Sarah's scanner detected protein structures that shouldn't exist, cellular activity that defied biological norms. But it was the sound that made them all freeze. A low thrumming that seemed to come from deeper in the mountain, rhythmic and purposeful, like a heartbeat magnified 1,000 times. "We need to go deeper," Marcus said, though every instinct screamed against it. The tunnel beyond the chamber sloped downward at a steep angle. Their lights revealed that the organic lining became thicker, more complex. What had seemed like simple preservation was actually cultivation. Something was growing in these tunnels, spreading through the mountain like a vast nervous system. Sarah's reading spiked. The biological activity is off the charts. Whatever this organism is, it's not from any known classification. The heartbeat sound grew stronger as they descended. Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't exploring a preservation facility or even a laboratory. They were inside something alive, something vast and ancient that had been feeding on whatever Ezra brought it. The tunnel curved ahead, and the first glimpse of the central chamber stopped them cold. In the dancing shadows of their flashlights, they could see it moving, pulsing, waiting. Riley's radio crackled with static, the signal unable to penetrate the living walls around them. They were alone with their discovery, and Marcus understood with crystalline clarity that some secrets were kept buried for very good reasons. The descent into Ezra's underground chamber felt like entering another world entirely. Dr. Sarah Chen's headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing walls that had been carved with meticulous precision. The air grew colder with each step, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the beam of light. "Jesus Christ," Detective Morrison whispered behind her, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "How deep does this thing go?" Agent Rivera's radio crackled with static as they moved deeper underground, the signal from the surface growing weaker. "We're losing communication," she reported, adjusting the frequency dial. "Whatever's down here, we're on our own." The narrow passage opened into a vast chamber that defied everything they thought they knew about Ezra Blackwood. Sarah's light swept across the space, revealing an intricate network of carved channels running along the walls, all leading to a central pit that seemed to swallow the darkness whole. "This isn't the work of some hermit," Sarah said, running her fingers along the smooth stone. "This is engineering, advanced engineering." The walls were covered in symbols, not random scratches, but deliberate markings that formed patterns. Some looked almost familiar, like corrupted versions of mathematical equations or chemical formulas. Others were completely alien, geometric shapes that hurt to look at for too long. Morrison's light found something that made him step back involuntarily. "Doc, you need to see this." Hanging from metal hooks driven into the rock were dozens of meat cuts, but they weren't like anything in Ezra's shop upstairs. These pieces looked fresh despite clearly being aged, with a strange luminescence that seemed to pulse in the artificial light. The smell was wrong too. Instead of the expected odor of curing meat, there was something sweet and metallic in the air. "The preservation method," Rivera breathed. "This is where he really does it." Sarah approached one of the hanging pieces, pulling out a small sample kit. As she got closer, she noticed something that made her stomach turn. The meat wasn't from any animal she recognized. The muscle fiber patterns, the way the fat was distributed, it was all wrong. "We need to get these samples to a lab immediately," she said, carefully collecting specimens. "And we need to find out what's in that pit." The central depression was approximately 8 feet across, perfectly circular, and carved so smoothly it looked almost polished. Sarah knelt at the edge and aimed her light downward. The beam disappeared into what seemed like an impossible depth. "There's something down there," Morrison said, pointing to a faint reflection far below. "Something metallic." Rivera was examining the channel system that fed into the pit. "Look at this," she called out. "These aren't just decorative, they're functional. There are dried residue marks here, like something flows through them regularly." Sarah followed one of the channels with her light, tracing its path around the chamber. Every few feet, there were small alcoves carved into the walls, each containing what looked like stone bowls. Some were empty, but others held substances she couldn't immediately identify, powders, crystals, and thick liquids that reflected her light with an oily sheen. "It's a processing system," she realized aloud. "Whatever Ezra's doing down here, it's not just meat preservation. It's something else entirely." Morrison's radio suddenly burst to life with garbled voices. "Found the missing hikers. God Almighty. You need to see this." "What missing hikers?" Rivera grabbed for her own radio, but the transmission had already dissolved back into static. The temperature in the chamber seemed to be dropping. Sarah's breath clouds were growing thicker, and ice was beginning to form on the metal hooks. But the preserved meat showed no signs of freezing. If anything, it seemed to be getting more active, the strange pulsing more pronounced. "We need to leave," Sarah said, though everything in her scientific mind screamed to stay and study what they'd found. "Right now." As they turned toward the passage leading back to the surface, Morrison's light caught something they'd missed on the way down. Carved into the wall near the entrance were names, dozens of them, scratched into the stone in different handwriting. Sarah recognized some from missing person reports that had crossed her desk over the years. At the bottom of the list, in fresh scratches that looked like they'd been made recently, were 3 names that made Rivera's blood run cold: David Chen, Marcus Torres, Jennifer Walsh, the research team that had gone missing 2 weeks ago. Below those names, in different handwriting entirely, someone had carved a single word that seemed to pulse with its own dark meaning: harvest. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the chamber system, slow and deliberate, accompanied by what might have been humming or chanting. Whatever they had stumbled into was far from over, and Ezra Blackwood was no longer their only concern. The descent into Caleb's underground chamber felt like entering another world entirely. Dr. Sarah Chen's headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing smooth stone walls that seemed almost deliberately carved. Behind her, Detective Morrison's breathing echoed in the confined space while Agent Torres brought up the rear, one hand resting on his weapon. "Jesus," Morrison whispered as they reached the bottom. "How deep does this go?" The chamber stretched beyond their light beams, far larger than any of them had anticipated. What struck Sarah most wasn't the size, but the temperature. It was perfectly regulated, neither the bone-chilling cold of a typical cave nor the dampness she'd expected. The air itself felt different, almost charged. Caleb moved ahead of them with the confidence of someone who'd walked these passages countless times. His earlier nervousness had vanished, replaced by something that made Sarah's skin crawl: pride. He was showing off his domain. "The meat storage is just ahead," he said, his voice carrying strangely in the space. "But first, you should see where it all begins." Torres's radio crackled with static, then went silent. Sarah noticed her phone had lost all signal 3 minutes into their descent. They were truly isolated down here, dependent entirely on Caleb's guidance to find their way back to the surface. "My great-grandfather discovered this place," Caleb said, running his hand along one of the platforms with disturbing reverence. "The old ways, passed down through our family for generations. The mountain provides, but only if you know how to ask properly." Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon. "Ask for what exactly?" Caleb smiled, and in the strange light, his features looked almost demonic. "Survival, immortality. The secret to preserving not just meat, but life itself." Sarah forced herself to examine the platforms more closely, fighting her revulsion. The stone wasn't natural. It had been shaped, polished, inscribed with symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly. The stains weren't just blood. They formed patterns, deliberate designs that suggested ritualistic purpose. "The meat preservation technique," she said slowly, pieces clicking into place. "It's not just about the environment down here. You're using these platforms." "The mountain demands payment," Caleb replied matter-of-factly. "Blood calls to blood. Life sustains life. Every piece of meat that never spoils, every winter my family survived when others starved, it all comes with a price." Torres had been silent, but now he stepped forward, his expression grim. "How many people, Caleb? How many disappearances were you responsible for?" "Disappearances?" Caleb laughed, a sound that echoed horribly in the cavern. "You think too small, Agent. I don't make people disappear. I make them eternal." He gestured toward a side passage Sarah hadn't noticed before. The bioluminescent glow was stronger there, almost blinding in its intensity. Something was moving in that direction, not walking but shifting, breathing. "The meat you found at my cabin," Caleb continued. "That's just the beginning. Down here, in the mountain's embrace, preservation becomes something far more profound. The old ones understood. They built this place for communion with forces that predate your civilization by millennia." Morrison drew his gun. "That's far enough. We're going back up now." But even as he spoke, Sarah heard it, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the rock itself. The bioluminescent patches pulsed brighter, and she felt a pull, almost magnetic, drawing her toward that side passage where something waited in the shadows. "You can't leave yet," Caleb said, and his voice had changed, become layered with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible. "The mountain has chosen you. Can't you feel it calling?" The humming grew louder, and Sarah realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the rock. It was coming from within the side passage, from whatever Caleb had preserved down there. The sound of voices, multiple voices, singing in unison, but no words she recognized, no language that belonged to the living world. Torres grabbed her arm. "We need to move, now." But the passage they'd entered through was no longer visible. The bioluminescent glow had shifted, rearranging the shadows, making the cavern seem to twist and reshape itself around them. They were trapped with Caleb and whatever horrors he'd been feeding for generations. The singing grew louder, and Sarah finally understood. This wasn't just about meat preservation. Caleb had found a way to preserve consciousness itself, trapping souls in an eternal half-life within the mountain's depths. And now they were next. The descent into Marcus's tunnel system felt like entering the digestive tract of some ancient beast. Dr. Chen's headlamp carved through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light itself. Behind her, Detective Morrison's breathing echoed off the narrow walls, each exhale forming visible puffs in the frigid air. "Jesus," Morrison breathed. "This space is massive." Chen swept her light across the chamber's floor, revealing a network of channels carved into the rock. A viscous, dark liquid flowed through them like blood through veins. The liquid caught their light strangely, seeming to absorb and reflect it simultaneously. As she approached, the liquid began to move, not flowing or rippling but writhing as if responding to their presence. Shapes formed beneath the surface, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, configurations that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could process. "This isn't a natural formation," Chen whispered. "The geological surveys never mentioned caverns of this size. They couldn't have missed something like this." Morrison aimed his light at the far wall and felt his stomach drop. Embedded in the rock were objects that clearly didn't belong, smooth metallic surfaces with angles too precise for natural formation. They pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, synchronized like a slow heartbeat. "How long has this been here?" Morrison asked, though he dreaded the answer. Chen was taking readings with instruments that seemed inadequate for whatever they were facing, the rock formation around those objects. "Morrison, this looks like the mountain grew around them. We're talking geological timescales." A sound echoed through the chamber, a deep, resonant hum that they felt in their bones more than heard with their ears. The liquid in the channels began flowing faster, and the bioluminescent pulses increased in frequency. "We need to go," Morrison said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "Now." But Chen was transfixed by her readings. "The electromagnetic signatures are off the charts. This isn't just preserving organic matter, it's rewriting it at the molecular level. The missing people, the transformed meat, it's all connected to this." The humming intensified, and Morrison felt a pressure in his head like the onset of a migraine. Images flashed behind his eyes, brief glimpses of the missing hikers, but wrong somehow. Their faces were too symmetrical, their movements too fluid. He saw them walking through the forest with purpose, heading toward predetermined destinations, with expressions of serene certainty. "They're not dead," Morrison said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "The missing people, they're changed, like the meat. Marcus isn't just preserving food down here." Chen finally looked up from her instruments, her face pale in the artificial light. "The cellular restructuring I observed in the tissue samples, if applied to living subjects." Another sound joined the humming, footsteps approaching from deeper in the chamber where their lights couldn't reach. Multiple sets, walking in perfect unison. Morrison drew his weapon, knowing instinctively that bullets would be useless against whatever was coming. The bioluminescent pulses reached a crescendo, and in their brief flashes of light, Morrison glimpsed figures moving in the darkness. Human shapes, but wrong in subtle ways that made his brain reject what his eyes were seeing. Too tall, joints bending in impossible directions, faces that were familiar yet alien. "Dr. Chen," Morrison grabbed her arm. "We leave now, or we don't leave at all." They ran for the tunnel entrance as the chamber erupted in light behind them. The preserved people, for that's what they had to be, made no sound as they pursued. Their silence was somehow more terrifying than any scream would have been. The tunnel seemed longer during their desperate retreat, stretching impossibly as if the mountain itself was trying to keep them. Behind them, the footsteps maintained their perfect rhythm, neither gaining nor falling behind, as patient and inexorable as time itself. The missing people, they're changed, like the meat. Marcus isn't just preserving food down here. Chen finally looked up from her instruments, her face pale in the artificial light. "The cellular restructuring I observed in the tissue samples, if applied to living subjects." Another sound joined the humming, footsteps approaching from deeper in the chamber where their lights couldn't reach. Multiple sets, walking in perfect unison. Morrison drew his weapon, knowing instinctively that bullets would be useless against whatever was coming. The bioluminescent pulses reached a crescendo, and in their brief flashes of light, Morrison glimpsed figures moving in the darkness. Human shapes, but wrong in subtle ways that made his brain reject what his eyes were seeing. Too tall, joints bending in impossible directions, faces that were familiar yet alien. "Dr. Chen," Morrison grabbed her arm. "We leave now or we don't leave at all." They ran for the tunnel entrance as the chamber erupted in light behind them. The preserved people, for that's what they had to be, made no sound as they pursued. Their silence was somehow more terrifying than any scream would have been. The tunnel seemed longer during their desperate retreat, stretching impossibly as if the mountain itself was trying to keep them. Behind them, the footsteps maintained their perfect rhythm, neither gaining nor falling behind, as patient and inexorable as time itself. Detective Marcus Rivera abandoned his phone call with the forensics team and crossed the room. Through the eyepiece, he saw what looked like a microscopic city, cells arranged in geometric perfection, pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm. "What am I looking at?" "I don't know." Sarah's admission hung heavy between them. "The protein chains are unlike anything in our databases. It's as if someone redesigned the fundamental building blocks of organic matter." Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows, while thunder rolled through the mountain passes. Sheriff Williams burst through the door, water streaming from his jacket. "We found 3 more bodies," he announced, breathing hard. "Hidden in caves about 2 miles from Ezra's property. Been there for months, maybe longer." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Condition?" Sarah looked up from her microscope, her face pale. "The preservation technique. He's been using it on people." The radio crackled to life. Deputy Foster's voice cut through the static, urgent and strained. "Sheriff, we have a problem at the Mitchell place. Ezra's gone, and there's something you need to see in the basement." 20 minutes later, they stood in Ezra's kitchen, water dripping from their rain gear. The house felt different now, charged with malevolent energy that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Foster led them to a door they'd somehow missed during their first search, hidden behind a false panel near the pantry. The basement stairs descended into absolute darkness. Their flashlight beams revealed stone walls carved directly from the mountain rock, smooth as glass and covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dancing light. The air grew thick as they descended, carrying the metallic taste of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. "Jesus Christ," Williams breathed. The basement opened into a vast chamber, much larger than the house above could possibly contain. Dozens of glass containers lined the walls, each filled with a viscous, glowing fluid. Inside the containers, suspended like grotesque specimens, were pieces of meat, organs, and worse, human body parts that pulsed with unnatural life. Sarah approached one of the containers, her scientific curiosity overriding her revulsion. "The fluid is maintaining cellular activity indefinitely. Look at this heart, it's still beating." Marcus found himself drawn to a workstation covered in journals, their pages filled with Ezra's careful handwriting and disturbing diagrams. "Listen to this," he said, reading from the most recent entry. "Day 847 of the great work. The formula grows stronger. Soon death itself will bend to my will. The mountain has shown me truths that science refuses to acknowledge." Day 847. Sarah calculated quickly. "That's over 2 years ago. How long has he been doing this?" Foster called out from the far end of the chamber. "There's more back here. Looks like some kind of altar." They followed his voice deeper into the mountain's belly. The altar was carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface stained with substances Marcus didn't want to identify. Arranged around it were more journals, these ones older, the handwriting deteriorating from careful script to manic scrawl. "The mountain speaks to those who listen," Sarah read aloud. "It offers gifts to those brave enough to receive them. Death is not the end. It is merely transformation waiting to be controlled." Marcus's radio buzzed. Detective Rivera, we've got reports of Ezra Mitchell seen heading toward the old mining tunnels on the north face. Should we pursue? Before Marcus could answer, a low rumble shook the chamber. Dust rained from the ceiling as the containers began to glow brighter. The preserved specimens inside started moving more frantically, pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. "We need to get out of here," William said, but his words were drowned out by a sound that chilled them all, footsteps echoing from the stairs above. Sarah grabbed several journals while Marcus gathered samples of the glowing fluid. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by what sounded like dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. "The back passage," Foster whispered, pointing to a tunnel opening they hadn't noticed before. "It has to lead somewhere." As they fled deeper into the mountain's heart, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just pursuing Ezra anymore. Something ancient and hungry had awakened in these depths, and their investigation had fed it exactly what it needed to grow stronger. The sound of pursuit followed them into the darkness. "You don't understand what you've found," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about preserving meat. It never was." Sarah exchanged glances with Hayes. The mysterious fungal network, the perfectly preserved specimens, the advanced biotechnology hidden beneath tons of mountain rock, none of it made sense with what they knew about Marcus or his family's history. Hayes looked up sharply from her equipment readings. "Schwarzwald? That was a Nazi research installation. It was destroyed in the war." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You're telling us this is Nazi research? That your family has been hiding war criminals?" "The criminals died decades ago," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "What survived was their work. And something else. Something that was already here, sleeping in the rock, before they ever arrived." "Wait for what?" Sarah demanded, though she was beginning to fear the answer. "For someone to help it spread beyond this mountain." The breathing sound grew louder, and Sarah realized it wasn't coming from deeper in the caves. It was coming from all around them. The entire chamber was breathing. The crystalline formations weren't just containing the fungal network, they were part of a larger organism that extended far beyond what they could see. "The meat preservation was just a cover story," Marcus continued, "a way to bring researchers and investigators close enough for it to study them, to learn about the outside world. My father fed it information for decades, news, technology, changes in human society, all while it grew stronger." Hayes grabbed Sarah's arm. "We need to leave, now. These readings suggest the organism is becoming more active. Our presence might be triggering something." But as they turned toward the tunnel they'd entered through, they found their path blocked. The opening had sealed itself with the same crystalline material that lined the chamber walls. The breathing sound intensified, and the bioluminescent veins began pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost like communication. "It won't let you leave," Marcus said, and Sarah couldn't tell if his tone held regret or resignation. "Not until it's finished learning from you." "Detective Chen, Dr. Hayes, you represent knowledge it's never had access to before, modern forensic techniques, advanced scientific equipment, direct contact with law enforcement networks." Sarah raised her weapon, though she wasn't sure what to aim at. The entire chamber seemed alive, watching them. "How long have you been working with it?" "I'm not working with it," Marcus said. "I'm trapped by it, just like you are now, just like my father was, and his father before him. We're not its partners, we're its prisoners. The only difference is that we learn to accept our cages." Hayes was backing against the sealed entrance, her equipment showing readings that defied comprehension. "Sarah, this organism, it's not just preserving and modifying biological matter, it's storing information, memories, everything it's consumed over the decades, including the people." The implications of her words settled over them like a shroud. Somewhere in this living mountain, the consciousness of Nazi scientists, local investigators who'd gotten too close, and generations of Marcus's family existed as part of something vast and patient and utterly alien. And now, it wanted to add them to its collection. Readings suggest the organism is becoming more active. Our presence might be triggering something. But as they turned toward the tunnel they'd entered through, they found their path blocked. The opening had sealed itself with the same crystalline material that lined the chamber walls. The breathing sound intensified, and the bioluminescent veins began pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost like communication. "It won't let you leave," Marcus said, and Sarah couldn't tell if his tone held regret or resignation. "Not until it's finished learning from you. Detective Chen, Dr. Hayes, you represent knowledge it's never had access to before. Modern forensic techniques, advanced scientific equipment, direct contact with law enforcement networks." Sarah raised her weapon, though she wasn't sure what to aim at. The entire chamber seemed alive, watching them. "How long have you been working with it?" "I'm not working with it," Marcus said. "I'm trapped by it. Just like you are now. Just like my father was and his father before him. We're not its partners, we're its prisoners. The only difference is that we learn to accept our cages." Hayes was backing against the sealed entrance, her equipment showing readings that defied comprehension. "Sarah, this organism, it's not just preserving and modifying biological matter, it's storing information, memories, everything it's consumed over the decades, including the people." The implications of her words settled over them like a shroud. Somewhere in this living mountain, the consciousness of Nazi scientists, local investigators who'd gotten too close, and generations of Marcus's family existed as part of something vast and patient and utterly alien. And now it wanted to add them to its collection. The descent into the cavern felt like entering the Earth's own digestive system. Detective Sarah Chen's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. Behind her, Dr. Marcus Webb's breathing echoed in short, nervous bursts, while Thomas Garrett moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had walked these tunnels countless times before. "How long has this been here?" Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to lower her voice. Thomas paused at a fork in the passage, his weathered hand trailing along the smooth stone wall. "My grandfather found it when he was 12. Been in the family ever since." His voice carried no pride, only the weight of inherited burden. "We've been guardians, not masters." The air grew thicker as they descended, carrying with it a strange metallic taste that made Sarah's tongue feel heavy. Dr. Webb had produced a small device that clicked steadily, its rhythm increasing as they moved deeper. They emerged into a vast chamber that defied Sarah's understanding of cave systems. The walls curved upward into darkness, and the floor beneath their feet felt warm, almost yielding. But it was the structures scattered throughout the space that made her blood run cold. Hundreds of meat preservation chambers lined the cavern walls, each one humming with the same low frequency they had heard above ground. But these were clearly not built by human hands. The organic curves and surfaces suggested something far older, far more alien than anything Thomas's family could have constructed. "Jesus Christ!" Webb breathed, his flashlight beam dancing across the nearest chamber. Through its translucent surface, Sarah could see the unmistakable shape of what had once been a deer, now perfectly preserved, but somehow fundamentally changed. Thomas moved to the center of the chamber, where a raised platform held what appeared to be a control mechanism. It pulsed with bioluminescent veins that spread across its surface like a neural network. "The missing hikers," Sarah said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "They're here, aren't they?" Thomas nodded slowly. "The cave. It feeds. Not often, maybe once or twice a year, but when it does, it chooses. Usually takes animals, but sometimes—" He gestured helplessly at several larger chambers along the far wall. Sarah forced herself to approach one of them. Inside, suspended in what looked like amber but felt warm to the touch, was the unmistakable form of a human being. The preservation was so perfect, she could see the individual hairs on the person's arm, the expression of peaceful sleep on their face. "They're not dead," Thomas said quietly. "Not exactly. The cave keeps them in between. Grandfather said it was waiting for something, building up energy for when the time comes. When what time comes? Webb demanded, his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. The answer came not from Thomas, but from the cave itself. The humming grew louder, and the bioluminescent veins began to pulse faster. The preserved specimens in their chambers twitched slightly, as if responding to some signal. "It knows we're here," Thomas said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "All of us together, the three bloodlines. It's been waiting for this." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. "Bloodlines? Why do you think you were assigned this case, Detective Chen? Your great-grandmother lived in these mountains for 30 years. And Dr. Webb, your research into biopreservation didn't just randomly bring you here." Thomas's eyes reflected the alien light of the cave's neural network. "We're all connected to this place, all chosen." The preservation chambers began to open with soft, wet sounds. The specimens inside remained motionless, but Sarah could see their eyes moving beneath closed lids. Whatever process the cave used, it was preparing to reverse it. Webb's device began clicking frantically. "The electromagnetic field is spiking. Something's happening." The platform in the center of the chamber erupted with light, and suddenly Sarah could see the true scope of what lay before them. The cavern extended far beyond what their flashlights had revealed, stretching into vast networks that seemed to span the entire mountain range. And everywhere, thousands upon thousands of preservation chambers containing specimens from across centuries. "It's not a cave," she realized with growing horror. "It's alive. The entire mountain system is one massive organism." Thomas nodded grimly. "And now that all three families are here together, it's ready to wake up completely. My family's been feeding it scraps for generations, keeping it dormant, but it was never about the meat." He looked at Sarah and Webb with something approaching pity. "We're the real meal, we always have been." The chamber shuddered, and somewhere in the depths below, something ancient and vast began to stir. The narrow tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, its walls gleaming with an otherworldly phosphorescence that made Sarah's skin crawl. Behind them, the sound of pursuit echoed through the cavern system, boots scraping against stone, voices calling out coordinates, the mechanical whir of equipment being deployed. "This way," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over their labored breathing. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage around his shoulder where Hartwell's bullet had grazed him during their escape from the laboratory. "There's another chamber about 50 meters ahead." Detective Chen pressed close behind them, her service weapon drawn despite knowing it would be useless against what they'd witnessed below. The memory of those preservation tanks haunted her, not just the perfectly preserved specimens from decades past, but the way they seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, as if something within them was still alive, still waiting. "How long has this been going on?" she asked through gritted teeth as they navigated a particularly narrow section of tunnel. Marcus paused at a junction, listening for signs of their pursuers. "My grandfather started the research in 1952. He was a biochemist obsessed with cellular regeneration. When he moved to these mountains, he discovered the fungal networks in these caves produced compounds unlike anything in the scientific literature." The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller but filled with ancient equipment. Microscopes, centrifuges, and monitoring devices that hummed with electrical current despite their apparent age. Sarah recognized some of the specimens in glass containers along the walls, samples of the same moss-like substance they'd found in Marcus's meat locker. "Your grandfather was preserving more than just food," Chen said, her voice heavy with accusation. Marcus nodded grimly. "The compounds worked too well. What started as food preservation became something else entirely. The cellular regeneration process wouldn't stop. It just kept going, creating hybrid organisms that defied natural law." Sarah examined one of the containers more closely and immediately wished she hadn't. Inside, what appeared to be human tissue writhed slowly, covered in the phosphorescent moss. "This is what you've been feeding people? This is what's in the meat you've been selling?" "No," Marcus said quickly. "I've been careful to use only the early-stage compounds for food preservation, but Hartwell and his team, they want the advanced specimens. They've been pressuring me for months, threatening to expose everything unless I gave them access to my grandfather's complete research. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the sweep of flashlight beams across the tunnel walls behind them. Chen moved to the chamber's entrance, positioning herself to cover their retreat. "We need to get out of here and contact federal authorities. This is bigger than a local investigation." "You don't understand," Marcus said desperately. "There is no getting out, not anymore. The compound doesn't just preserve, it spreads. Everyone who's consumed the treated meat, everyone who's been exposed to the spores in these caves, they're all connected now, part of the network." Sarah felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. "What do you mean, connected?" Before Marcus could answer, Dr. Hartwell's voice echoed through the tunnels, amplified by some kind of communication device. "Mr. Coleman, you're only delaying the inevitable. The specimens have already been secured. Your cooperation is no longer strictly necessary." Marcus's face went pale. He's triggered the containment breach. All those years of carefully controlled specimens, he's released them into the cave system. As if summoned by his words, a new sound reached their ears, a wet, sliding noise like something massive moving through the tunnels behind them. The phosphorescent light along the walls began to pulse more rapidly, and Sarah noticed that some of the specimens in the chamber's containers were responding to the rhythm, their movements becoming more agitated. "There's an emergency exit," Marcus said, moving to what appeared to be a solid wall. He pressed against a specific section, and a narrow passage opened, leading upward. "My grandfather built it as a fail-safe, but it leads directly into the town's water supply." Chen lowered her weapon, understanding the implications immediately. "If those compounds reach the water system, the entire town becomes part of the network," Marcus finished. "Every person, every living thing. That's what Hartwell really wants. Not just the preservation technology, but the complete integration protocol my grandfather developed in his final years." The sliding sound grew closer, and now they could see something moving in the tunnel behind them, something that reflected the phosphorescent light in ways that hurt to look at directly. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him toward the emergency exit. "We have to warn them," she said. "Whatever the cost, we can't let this spread beyond these mountains." As they squeezed into the narrow upward passage, the chamber behind them erupted in chaotic light and sound. The specimens had broken free from their containers, and somewhere in the tunnels below, Dr. Hartwell was screaming orders that would never be followed. The real horror was just beginning. The cavern trembled as Dr. Sarah Chen backed toward the narrow passage, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls lined with Marcus's impossible preserves. Behind her, Detective Ray Morrison's radio crackled with static, the signal barely penetrating the rock overhead. Marcus stood between them and the main entrance, his weathered face calm despite the chaos erupting above ground. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Marcus said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. 40 years I've protected this place. 40 years of keeping the balance." Sarah's heart hammered as she swept her light across the shelves of perfectly preserved meat, some dating back decades according to their handwritten labels. The organisms she'd discovered here defied every principle of microbiology she knew. They didn't just prevent decay, they seemed to enhance the tissue, creating something entirely new. "The balance of what?" Morrison demanded, his weapon drawn but lowered. "We found the missing hiker's belongings in your cabin, Marcus. We know what you've been doing." The mountain man's laugh was bitter. "You know nothing. Those people were already dead when I found them. Exposure, falls, bear attacks, the mountain's claim lives every winter. I gave them purpose instead of letting them rot." A distant explosion shook dust from the ceiling. Sarah realized the military units Chen had called in were using charges to widen the cave entrance. Soon this place would be swarming with hazmat teams and government scientists who would see only the potential for biological weapons. "The organism," Sarah said, stepping closer to Marcus despite Morrison's warning gesture. "It's not from here, is it?" "Not originally." Marcus's eyes met hers, and she saw something that looked almost like relief. You're the first one to ask the right question. It came down with the meteor strike in 1982. Most folks remember the light show, but nobody talked about what landed up in the high peaks. A meteor? Morrison's voice carried disbelief. You're saying this thing is from outer space? I was hunting when it hit, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who'd carried a secret too long. Found the crater while it was still smoking. The rock was covered in this grey film, like mold but different. When I touched it, it burned, but not like fire, like cold electricity. Sarah's mind raced. An extraterrestrial organism would explain the unprecedented biological properties she'd observed, but it raised questions that terrified her. How long before it started changing you? Marcus held up his hands, and Sarah saw what she'd missed before. His fingernails weren't dirty. They were shot through with the same grey veins she'd seen in the preserved tissues. Months. Started small, like frostbite that wouldn't heal. But then I realized I wasn't getting sick anymore. Cuts healed faster. I could work in temperatures that should have killed me. Another explosion. Closer this time. Voices echoed from the main tunnel. The assault team had broken through. Why the meat? Morrison asked. Why preserve it like this? It has to feed, Marcus said simply. The organism needs organic matter to reproduce, to survive. I fed it what the mountain provided. Animals that died natural deaths, people who were already gone. Better than letting it spread wild, better than letting it starve and die out completely. Sarah understood with horrifying clarity. Marcus hadn't been a killer. He'd been a guardian, containing something that could have consumed the entire ecosystem. But he'd also been nurturing it, keeping it alive for 4 decades. There are samples all over this cave, she said. If the military destroys this place, spores could scatter across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The voices were getting closer. Sarah could hear the hiss of oxygen tanks and the rustle of protective suits. In minutes, soldiers would flood this chamber with flamethrowers and chemical sterilizers, never realizing they might be unleashing the very catastrophe they meant to prevent. There's another way out, Marcus said, turning toward a crack in the far wall that Sarah had dismissed as too narrow to navigate. Leads to an old mine shaft. You could take samples, study them properly instead of letting the government turn them into weapons. Morrison shook his head. We can't just let you disappear. Those families deserve answers about their missing loved ones. They deserve the truth, Marcus replied. But they also deserve a world that isn't consumed by something we don't understand. The first helmeted figure appeared at the cave entrance, assault rifle raised. Sarah had seconds to decide. She could surrender the samples to the military and watch them vanish into classified research programs, or she could trust a man who'd spent 40 years protecting humanity from something beyond their comprehension. She grabbed 3 vials from the nearest shelf and followed Marcus toward the crack in the wall. Behind them, Morrison's voice rose as he tried to explain the situation to the assault team leader. The mountain man squeezed through the narrow opening with surprising agility, and Sarah realized this wasn't the first time he'd used this escape route. As she slipped into the darkness after him, she wondered if she was saving the world or dooming it.